Hello and welcome to Fearless DIY Music. My name is Tristan Lass, and today I am once again joined by my dear friend Kevin Gamble. He and I are going to have a conversation about a topic, but before we jump into that, I just wanted to see if Kevin has anything he would like to bring up about recent content on the channel.
Well, good to see you again, Tris. Good to be here. And before we move on, I wanted to quickly jump back to our last conversation on the channel about the Kinks and comparing them to the Beatles and the animated conversations that prompted. A lot of people had strong opinions and good points about it, but one takeaway for me from that discussion was that it prompted me to go back and revisit some of their later work to remind myself of what that was like and what they were doing, and pulled up a few videos of some of their 80s songs and live performances, and was really struck by how energetic and vital and authentic it was. One video I pulled up was a live performance of them doing You Really Got Me Going Into Destroyer.
Oh, yeah.
And if someone didn't know anything about the Kinks and you played that video for them, you would think they were a brand new band coming out in 1982. They would slot right in along musically and energetically alongside television, the sort of cutting edge, energetic punk, a new wave type of energy of the time. They were right there in the middle of it, still being their authentic selves and carrying that energy, but still having their own sort of angle on everything. And song after song I went through,
Yeah,
I was
punk and
surprised.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm talking over you. I just wanted to interject really quick. Punk and new wave served them really well because they kind of had inspired it to begin with.
Yes. Yeah, they had that energy, but it was authentic. It was themselves. And when I saw them play those two songs end to end, it really hit home how much their identity carried through that whole period. So we'll put some links down in the description so people can check those out. But I saw so many songs that I had actually remembered and forgotten. I think that kind of popular media memory hole didn't serve me very well, because I realized there were things that I knew already and that had impacted me, and I remembered, and it came back watching them. They've been, I think, unfairly overlooked by a lot of the mainstream since then. But so glad we had that conversation.
I am too. I did, kind of come up with the idea for it as, a couple people accused me of clickbait, but everything on YouTube is clickbait because everybody wants to have their videos viewed. But I did think it was I was being authentic and I was being genuine in my opinions on this, because I feel like that kind of carry through with them, it just kind of still goes on. Whereas I feel like the Beatles, yes, they, tremendous impact, most popular band of all time, arguably. And but I feel like there's a through line with the Kinks. It's just more consistent and realistic. The Beatles are this like thing up on a pedestal. Another thing that a couple people brought up in the comments that I think is worth mentioning, bears mentioning, is that the Beatles were very much a group effort by, like George Martin. Like somebody brought up, don't forget about George Martin. Then you've got the fact that they were so important culturally that the culture itself propped them up any way that they could as well, because it was like a self-reinforcing cycle. So the tremendous popularity of the Beatles isn't just due to the Beatles' merit. It's all these other ingredients that are thrown in that make them mythical. And, and I'm talking, when I was talking about the authenticity of the Kinks, it's more just like, okay, here's a band,
Yes.
and by the way, somebody also mentioned, well, nobody knows any of their names except for Ray and Dave. Well, Mick Avery was their drummer pretty much the whole way through. So Mick Avery was right there the whole time. They did go through a rotating cast of bass players relatively. But I just wanted to bring that up, that there were a lot of other ingredients going into the Beatles, and then one person mentioned, oh, well, the Beatles had movies. Where were the Kinks movies? And it's like, well, it's because the Kinks weren't a commodity the same way the Beatles were. It's kind of like comparing, Tool to the Backstreet Boys. You know what I mean? You're going to get people in the theater to go see the Backstreet, during that time period, but nobody would want to go see a concert film of Tool. They would just want to go see Tool play live, So it's
Yeah,
just
by the time of the 80s, it really did feel like the Beatles had become kind of just a cultural abstraction almost. Paul McCartney was almost the only one, notably active and doing songs with Stevie Wonder and Michael Jackson. It was almost more sort of novelty at that point, very accomplished novelty. But when you compare that to what the Kinks were doing at that same time, still really fully creating new artistic works through their own sensibilities and having something to say with it. I was trying to think of other contemporaries of the time who would still be carrying on to that extent, and I'm not sure anyone completely matched how much they remained themselves. You had the Who still
that's what I
making
was
new
going to say.
music.
Eminence Front is a
Eminence
song that
Front,
pops into my head. That was a
yeah,
vital song. Maybe their
yes.
last great song. And that was early '80s.
Yeah, so that was. I'm trying to think of anyone else the Rolling Stones were still going. They were, maybe kind of
Tattoo
doing
You.
things that were pretty familiar. Yeah. So, but I think looking back at it and listening to it, the Kinks were right there at that level. They just weren't getting they didn't have the cultural cachet here, as you had mentioned. So, but
Yeah.
very much worth revisiting.
Yes, and if I had to pick, a standout track for somebody who's seeing this or that has never heard the song, "Destroyer's" the song, from the late period, and you really got me, and "Destroyer" are great bookends, just to kind of get your
Yes.
education on the Kinks. And then everything in between. There's almost every flavor of song and experiment that you'd want to hear in between those two bookends. So. All right. Well, I'm glad that this topic got people talking. That's what we want. We want people in the comments going nuts. And I noticed that a lot of the comment chains went right past anything that Kevin and I had to say and continued on with people talking to each other. And that's what this is all about. We want to just encourage these kinds of discussions. And the topic for today, I hope, will encourage a lot of discussion. It's something that I am utterly ill-equipped to talk about, but I feel like I want to talk about it because two things came up this week that got me thinking. I have never used digital modeling amps or done captures of real-world amps in a digital environment to use as part of my guitar rig. I have to say that right up front so that anybody who is completely, in that world and knows a lot more about it, hit in the comments, please. Correct me, correct Kevin. Kevin has a little bit more, know-how on this topic. But here's the two things that inspired me to go on this topic. One is I was watching a video doing a demonstration of the Tonex product. It's a little box, you can do amp captures and stuff like that. And during the course of the demonstration, they were talking about, the people who were doing it. We're talking about some of the shortcomings of the system, and they were detailing, kind of the convoluted signal chain required to do a capture, and that the capturing process, albeit this product is relatively budget for that kind of device, from my understanding, is also fairly robust, but it was very convoluted as how to use it. They made mention of, neural, of all sorts of other products that do better, from Kemper to what's the one I'm thinking? Neural DSP is what I'm thinking about, which leads me to the second part. So anyway, these two people are wrestling with how to get a good amp capture out of this product that's supposed to be easy. You put it on the floor, and then you have a model of your amp that you can take to your gigs, so you don't have to take your amp. I get why these things are important. Okay. Then I came across an article about Neural DSP, and apparently they've created a system called the Telemetric Inductive Nodal Activator, and the acronym is TINA. So anyway, this robot, what it does is it actually turns all of the physical knobs on a particular device or amp so that during the capture process, the robot is interfacing with the DSP to give you the full range of each potentiometer, which apparently up to this point has either been a virtual exercise or just snapshots and not happening at all. in the capturing process for either an amp modeler or for a capturing device that you would use at home to capture your own amp. So these two things prompted me to ask, so is this all the tech around this from Kemper's 10 years ago or whenever they came out? I think they came out about a decade ago, and then all these other modeling amps and systems that are out there, are they going to even be relevant after some of this new tech and these new capturing techniques are going to be put into place? Will this TINA system by Neural DSP become an industry standard? And Kevin, I know that you use a device that is akin to these things, and I would like to hear what you think. Do you think that everything that's come before will eventually end up in a thrift store, or are we going to see that stuff carry on as a legacy, as legacy products, or is it just going to be a whole new universe every 10 years with this technology?
Yeah, those are great questions, Tris. And with the rate of technology evolving, I think it gets harder and harder to predict in some ways. But that was an interesting story about the Tina. There was something almost a little quaint, I thought, about in this age of, AI and machine learning and so forth, building a robot to turn knobs almost felt like a throwback to, it's like, this is the vision of the future from like 60 years ago, how things would work. We'll all have robots turning the knobs of our amps. But
Jetsons, very Jetsons.
It's very Jetsons. But of course, it's connected to something far more sophisticated.
Very powerful.
But very interesting, very incredible technology and interesting concept. It doesn't seem like it's immediately usable or possible for that to be ported into everyone's own experiences with their own amps and equipment. The idea of essentially being able to back up your physical hardware digitally and use it is really interesting. And I think that's a natural progression from so many other things going digitally. I don't know how feasible it is, but it's interesting because if you're doing something besides backing up, so to speak, your own amp, your own pedals, whatever the case may be, it struck me that this type of modeling of amplifiers is creating an experience for people that they don't have a physical point of reference for. So there's the option of doing it kind of the complicated and ineffective, somewhat ineffective way, do it yourself. But this kind of next level modeling, it seems that, it'll give a very thorough profile of an amplifier. But if you haven't experienced that amplifier, then it's really just as much of a simulation as anything else. And
how would you know the difference is what you're kind of saying there?
Would you know the difference? Would you be able to appreciate it? Is interacting with it in a different way than what people have done with the physical device in a physical space? Does it fundamentally change the experience of using those controls that have been modeled so thoroughly? Do you really have access to the same experience through a simulation where there's no physical reality to it at all? So that opens the question of where is the line between the authentic and the completely dehumanized experience? And just to take a quick step back on that question, it's kind of an eternal debate of, is technology advance? Is it the same as it's always been? Oh, people have always had these questions about technology ever since, we first had recording or electric instruments or synthesizers or sequencers. A lot of people just say, oh, it's the same as it's always been. But I think it's important for us to bring up these questions, because I think that even as technology changes, the question about what is authentic and in the creative process, what is the integrity of the creative process, and where does it stop being a human endeavor, is only getting more relevant as this kind of technology advances that can potentially take humans out of the loop altogether. But that's getting a little far afield from the question of amp modelers, but it does
raise those questions.
It does raise those questions about what what will be the purpose of these things down the road? Is synthetically replicating the analog process going to matter as we get much further into the digital realm? It's a little hard to say as more time passes and more people pass on who kind of gave us those touch points in our background.
Yeah. I agree. I agree with all of that assessment, but I kind of want to like reel it back into something a little bit more basic and something a little bit more about just like the fact that sitting here today, like over the past 10 years, you know, these devices and all these different systems have been developed, they've been marketed, people have spent, I mean, like Fender marketed that brick that ended up going nowhere, and it was like $2,000. And what I want to kind of discuss is, or loop back to, is, you know, is it worth buying any of these actual box products that do cost quite a bit of money, like more than like you could buy a handful of amps, you know, of relatively inexpensive amps for what you could buy a really nice system, a modeling system. Why not? So my question is, why should we even bother with this hardware, since if a company like Neural DSP is going to have a robot that will actually do such a good job of capturing real world amps, you wouldn't even bother modeling your own JCM 800. You would just use their model of it.
Yeah.
And so why buy these things that are so crazy expensive? And then that kind of ties into what you were saying though about, is the mechanical object even relevant anymore at that point? You know, isn't it, why not just use the digital stuff that's just, you know, just use software and not even bother with any more of this stuff? And I guess my point coming to that kind of conclusion is that, well, what is, you know, I feel bad for people who maybe have used their money to buy a lot of stuff that's all going to end up being like Betamax. That's kind of my point to all this, is that all of this irrelevant, potentially irrelevant, you know, really, you know, disposable equipment. I know there's some people who'll probably be like, you know, kind of like old, like I am. I'll play my PV Bandit till I die, and they'll be like, I'll play my Kemper till I die, you know. But I think that eventually it's all just going to be replaced, don't you think? That there won't really be a need for it.
The recent history, the last couple decades of digital tech has mostly been disposable. You know, there's guitars, amps, pedals, synthesizers hold up over time and are still valued, but has digital specific tech from the last 20 years held up over time? It seems to get replaced and thrown out as quickly as possible. Even the original Kempers now look a bit, you know, quaint, the big toolbox sized things that cost so much and relative to what's going on now have so many limitations. And so I think you're right. I think that the digital means to accomplishing this is what's going to get turned over again and again and again. And it's going to get smaller. It's going to get more efficient. It's going to get more accessible. And then what's left is the analog equipment remaining just as accessible and usable and adaptable as it's always been.
Yeah. So I guess that the only reason for the objects, the physical objects, to exist, like these little stomp, you know, like you have all the stuff and you put it into a box, is so you can take it with you and use it on stage. I mean, and I would imagine that at some point a company is going to kind of win that race, don't you think? And it'll just kind of be one thing, and then you buy various programs to just dump into it, and that would be kind of the end of the game. I mean, some people like to say, oh, well, I like this interface better, and the usability of this one is better. But won't there come a point, kind of like the way computers plateaued, where it's like, oh, okay, you know, you could buy like 50 different brands of computers, but they're all essentially the same machine. You know, there's not that much difference between them. And I'm wondering, do you see a future relatively soon where maybe all these flavors will kind of start going away, where there'll be a lot more losers than winners?
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great question, and I'm surprised now that you bring it up. It seems like the world of music has resisted that tendency. It seems like there have been many people who've tried to be the one standard for things, but it still has, whether it's, you know, DAW software or guitar models themselves or various kinds of modelers. Every time one comes up and looks like the new standard, another one comes up along and pushes it aside. And so I think it almost seems like as everything gets more digital, that type of simplicity is almost inevitable, just because people, I think, would be in some ways relieved to have a platform, a standard. It's like, I've got my operating system. I don't have to think about that anymore. And it also just creates a more efficient pipeline for them to sell us things if it's all one shoot,
Sure.
instead of fragmented across a bunch of different distribution channels. So it does seem inevitable, but I don't see something right now that looks like that.
Yeah, but I think that will be the end game. It'll be, akin to, you either have an Android phone or an iPhone, and then you'll load whatever you need into it, and it'll have, like two big buttons on it, or a touch screen for scrolling your presets real quick, or even something that's wearable, and you just go boom, okay, there we go, there's my settings for that song. And I think that it's going to come to that, and I think that all the stuff that's been out there for the past 10-15 years and all the stuff that's coming out now, it just all feels like this stuff is just not going to be around. It's going to end up, like I said, it's going to all end up in thrift stores someday, just like, oh yeah, I remember that. Because it's going to come to that, I think.
Yeah, and I think what makes that not the case? Do you reach a point where you have the perfect emulation that is the perfect usable object? I think in some ways it's almost like the uncanny valley of music, where it's like, will we ever get to a point where you can't advance that and can't make something redundant if what it is an imitation of something else?
Mm-hmm.
You can't make a Stratocaster more perfect as a Stratocaster. You can modify it, you can change it, you can change the functioning of it, but you can't really advance it, so to speak. But digital tech imitating a physical music object, it's always going to have room for
Sure,
being rendered out of date.
I think you're right. All right. Well, I would really like to see people hop in on this, and I think it's something we'll probably be discussing more in the future. I just, due to the fact that I don't personally own any of these types of devices, I've always just, used my amp in the room, but I'm not performing anymore. And I'm sure that if I were still a gigging musician, I would probably be investigating or would have already purchased one of these items. And I would hope that I wasn't pissed off that all of a sudden it became irrelevant, within a couple years after spending over $1,000 on something like that. So if you've made it this far into the video, I would love it if you would subscribe. Kevin and I love the comment section. Keep them coming. We'll both hop in there and address things as best as we can. Kevin will be dropping some links and some chapter titles into this video, and we look forward to likes and shares as well. And subscriptions are doing very well. Let's keep it going, and we'll start unlocking some new stuff that we'll all enjoy. All right, take care, and we'll see you next time.